Rose, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that all that this young girl talked about is so overwhelming. I mean, after the overview that she has given, I'm sure it's so much amount of work, that lies upon all of us to do. And therefore, and more so, given the unique challenges that our country possesses because of its demography and geography, uh, there are a large number of key action areas, which Isha has already, kind of highlighted. So what do you think, where should we begin? What should be those key action areas? What would be the low-hanging fruits? Which could be the quick wins? And what should be our long-term strategy? I would be happy to, hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashwini. I'm really privileged to be on this chat with you, and thank you to ICC colleagues, to Shloka and Isha and others. I was looking for a fireside background to use on Zoom, but I couldn't quite find one in time. I wish I had. I think that there's a lot of knowledge in the room. So in a sense, I see our role as kind of trying to stimulate some of that knowledge. But I thought it might be worth, I think it's very important to end up, in a sense, come back to where Isha has left us with some very concrete ideas about what to do. But I thought maybe we could just step back for a minute and understand the scale and scope of the scale and scope of the challenge in front of us before we get into something more concrete, maybe later in the chat. And I think that, we all care about India's development. We all care about India's growth. And with climate change, I think we have to understand that the game has changed. There is no longer a high carbon path to development open to any country, including India. We just don't have that option, which means that it can be both very challenging, but also a potential opportunity. At the same time, we also don't have the option of not thinking about whether we are building a resilient society and economy, right? So those sound like two very big challenges, but the useful thing is that there's a way through this. The way through this is to say, are we mainstreaming? Are we thinking about low carbon options? Are we thinking about climate resilient options every time we make a decision? Whether that decision is in energy use, whether that decision is in how we use, whether the decision is in energy supply or in energy use, as well as in areas like cropping choices, how we are using water, and so on and so forth. So I think having that slightly bigger picture and saying, at one level, we can't get overwhelmed by this climate challenge. The climate challenge can be boiled down to saying, are we making the right choices towards a low carbon future and towards a resilient future? And that is a good kind of guiding framework that allows us to take the decisions we have to make and pass them through this filter. So I don't know if that's useful, but that's sort of a high level way in which I think about this.
No, I appreciate what you're saying. That's perhaps the only way of looking at the challenges that are in front of us.
So I'm very curious. I mean, in your foundation, you have to quickly bring it down to earth. At JSW Foundation, how have you been thinking about the challenge and the way in which you've taken forward your work, and as you've begun to engage climate change at the JSW Foundation?
So interesting, because normally I think the word climate change has got into our lexicon quite recently. But the interesting fact is that JSW began its foray into climate action way back in 2008, and I would perhaps assume even before that, because in 2008 JSW got its first set of carbon credits. And my predecessor, who was the CEO of the foundation, he decided that, rather than using these carbon credits for any business purposes, let's use these carbon credits for working on climate change itself. And that was the genesis of the Earth Care Awards in 2008. The idea was that whatever carbon credits were generated, those funds, those resources should be put into Earth Care Awards. And the Earth Care Awards took birth in 2008 in collaboration with Times of India. And it's perhaps one of the most unique programs where, from individual to institutional to community level efforts for climate change adaptation, mitigation, those actions are being, recorded and appreciated and felicitated. And this is perhaps one of those first, I would say it's in its 11th edition now this year. And the idea is that, we continue to identify such partners, such institutions, individuals and recognize their efforts, because that's going to create that level of awareness. Uh, in terms of our real action, I would say the first program that we took up was development of mangroves. In fact, looking at a very unique, specific variety of mangroves. I think Xylocarpus, if I remember correctly, which was under the IUCN Red category, and we started working on restoration of those mangroves, and then moved into mangrove restoration through a livelihoods approach in an area of Maharashtra, where almost like 2 million plantations of mangroves have been done with a success ratio of more than 80%. Tree plantation, I think, had been there with JSW Foundation right from day one, and it continues to happen. But we moved on, learning from our experiences that biodiversity protection also is a very important element. And therefore, we switched on to indigenous varieties, looking at Miyawaki forests. And I think one sea change that came somewhere around 2017, 18, I would say, was that, we were working on watershed and water development programs, water management programs from donkey years. But we realized that, this sector requires a whole lot of holistic approach and a very data-driven approach. And that is what led us to build up an entire portfolio of a GIS mapping of all our JSW locations, whether inside the plant boundaries or outside the plant boundaries, and looking at the entire regional landscape, which can provide the right kind of blueprint for not just us but to anybody who would like to work in the space of water, because water and watershed development would continue to be one of the most important areas for climate action, if we have to consider the challenges that we have in our country. So, in a nutshell, I would say, this long journey from 2008 to say 2023 has been around, looking at how we can directly implement, and also at the same time create an ecosystem by which other institutions can be identified and their work can be recognized, and we can create a platform to learn from each other. And that's the reason why we were one of the first founding members of ICC itself. And now, we are talking about this platform, for climate action. So I think this is how it has happened. In terms of the business agenda, I think JSW Steel itself has, generated a lot of interest by going, talking about green steel and, raising funds through a green bond. So our commitments towards, carbon mitigation, carbon footprint reduction, water footprint reduction, it's a great congruence between what we try doing as a foundation and what we try doing as a business.
I thought it was very interesting, actually, and it's been a long and a journey with lots of sort of important benchmarks. I thought it was very interesting that you gave examples of both very specific things that you have done around in particular areas around, whether it's land use and so on, as well as you said, the more systemic changes. So you looked at sort of GIS and mapped out all your sort of locations and looked at how you would sort of change patterns across your various resources. I think that's actually a really important indication to people on this call. I think that we have to have a mix of very specific and concrete things that companies can do through their CSR, whether it is building resilience in communities. So it might be, for example, that if we face increasing heat waves, then one can be funding sort of cooling shelters and cool zones for vulnerable communities. That's something very specific and concrete one can do. But similarly, I think, the bigger, broader structural issues that may be beyond an individual company, but where clusters of companies can come together. I've noted, for example, been preparing for this call, I was looking at some of the data on vulnerability, right? And it turns out that some 3/4 of the urban land that is vulnerable to sea level rise is in Southeast and South Asia, right? So this is a huge area of vulnerability across our cities. Or, for example, crop vulnerability. So for those corporations that are working, or those companies that are working in agriculture, India and South Asia is among the areas that are most vulnerable to cropping pattern changes. How do we then think about engaging in concrete areas, but also working with intermediaries, whether it's research organizations, working with the government to bring about broader changes? I just want to sort of flag one piece of work that we've done at CPR. I'm just going to put a link in the chat. We recently looked at, for example, heat action plans across India and what they have done. And it maps out the kinds of activities. So one can, in fact, a CSR, as part of CSR, one can look at the range of activities that the government is thinking of doing around heat to prepare and sort of pick up elements of them for support. So in other words, I think why I'm so invested in this effort by ICC is that it can seem overwhelming as to how you interact on climate change, and having the solutions laid out and they're sort of made more approachable and accessible, I think is very important. But I would just end with this message that I think you can have direct impact, but also think about ways of engaging at a higher scale, so that the impact adds up to become more than the sum of the parts. I think something like that would be very useful. But from your perspective, Ashwini, I would be very curious to know, because you have built this at JSW yourself, what do you think corporations engaging in CSR, what kinds of support do they need to make their support more effective and to leverage it to have greater impact?
Yeah, Navroz, I'll come to that. In fact, I was more tempted to first draw upon what you said, and I think you touched upon a very important part, that the integration between various components of work that we do as institutions. So whether it's watershed, or whether it's agriculture, or whether it's pure climate action work, how these are all the agencies of these action points, how they can lead to a whole lot of integrated, I would say, policy level interventions. Because the biggest challenge that we face in our country is about working into silos, and
Yes.
whether it's at an institutional level, or whether even it is at a policy level. And unfortunately, perhaps the research institutions are also not able to connect those dots. So in fact, before coming to how CSR itself can be useful, it would be interesting for me to understand from you that since you've been focusing more around policy and the scientific and the technical aspects, and this platform that we are kind of trying to convene and design is going to be a confluence of knowledge institutions, implementers, donors. What do you think should be the ground action plan, where maybe CSR funding could be of any essence, and perhaps if there could be any other grant models or funding models which would perhaps be more impactful? I think it would be interesting to first understand from you on that.
Well, thank you. That's a very challenging question. And that coordination point that you bring up is, of course, at all levels. We have silos in government, you have silos in academia, you have silos in industry, and we all have to, I think, break through those silos. One way in which I have found it quite useful to think about this is to think about the big changes that India is undergoing anyway, where we really have to think about how we make those changes more resilient. So, for example, India is urbanizing very rapidly. Now, that changing shape of our cities impacts a whole set of companies across different sectors. It affects companies involved in transport, it affects companies involved in construction, including in water use, and so on and so forth. So how can we re-envision urbanization? And the government has got to play a role in that. But then conversely, how do you break that down into concrete things that one can do? Now, we know, for example, that water efficiency is a win-win solution. Water efficiency is something that India needs to do anyway, and we need to do it particularly for a climate resilient future. So thinking about how one can both collaborate around something concrete like water efficiency, as well as pick up particular aspects or particular projects that will enhance efficiency use in the parts of the parts of the industry or parts of society we know best. I think it's that one has to be able to move back and forth between those levels in order to, as you say, break silos. But this is something that clearly you've tried to do at JSW, and is this something that you found feasible? What has made it possible for you to do that? I see we have a friendly 2-minute warning, so this is you probably get the closing word here.
Okay, so coming back to your question, which you asked me, I think where CSR can be perhaps supported. So I would like to bring up 3 points. looking at CSR at the larger ecosystem level with a different lens altogether. So climate action, as we all understand, is a long-term process. A whole range of series of programs need to be carried out to actually achieve something on climate action. So, so the paradigm of looking at CSR as a short-term immediate gratification or a feel-good factor, I think that's one big, perception which has to be built around. That CSR is not just about that; it's about a much longer-term engagement and investment towards a brighter future. I think that larger ecosystem messaging needs to be continuously be done, and it has to be done by all constituents of this space. The second thing is, that CSR to be more effective has to be continuously looked at as sustainability and CSR being two sides of the same coin. It cannot be like you cannot alienate social and environmental sustainability from each other. They are inseparable in that sense. And so therefore, this equation also has to change. And this is where I think the effectiveness of CSR as a framework would, continue to improve. At the second level, which is, I would say, the stakeholders level, this is where a much greater emphasis has to come on pilots, looking at projects like, the platform that we are discussing today about, looking at how commingling of private and public sector funding can happen, because CSR would always have a limitation in terms of to what extent it can actually influence. It can play a catalytic role, but after that, for that catalytic reaction to reach its culmination and bring the impactful, tangible results, which is going to motivate other people to take it up further, would be requiring a much larger amount of funding. And that's where I think I would say the stakeholder level or community level engagement would be important. And lastly, but importantly, at the institution level, at a corporate level also, within the corporates, how more convergence can happen, number one. Number two, how we can look at, the integration of CSR more and more into business and look at it more as a value addition